My name is Rose, and I'm the program manager here at the Scott County Historical Society, and I'm about to take you on a tour of our brand new exhibit, Votes for Women, Suffrage in Scott County. So I'm going to go through the panels with you, I'm going to share artifacts, and then also share a little bit of supplemental information. If you have any questions about this exhibit, feel free to let us know. You can email us at info@scottcountyhistory.org or visit us online at our website at scottcountyhistory.org. Thanks. So by way of introduction, on August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the United States was ratified, giving many women the right to vote in nationwide elections for the first time. This may seem like a sudden change, but women and men across the country had been working for decades to secure the vote through high-profile events and tireless grassroots community organizing efforts. In Scott County, we know of two different suffrage committees that were long-standing enough to publish their work in the local newspapers. There were likely many more residents who supported the cause. Methods of communication may have changed, but grassroots work in local communities is still an important way to improve our world. How would you make the world a better place? A bit more background on the history of suffrage in Minnesota and nationally. Suffrage sprang out of a long-standing national movement in the U.S. to grant legal rights to women. In the 1820s, women began to push for the right to own property in their own names, and later to continue owning property after marriage, to control and make decisions about the property they owned, and to keep the wages that they earned. This, like suffrage, was a long battle with incremental victories state by state over the next 100 years. By the 1850s, along with these basic rights, women began pushing also to own and manage businesses in their own names and, of course, to vote. In Minnesota, women were granted the right to collect wages and control income in their own name in 1869, and the right to own businesses in 1874. Voting was a step along the way. After the right to vote was granted, women fought for the right to retain citizenship if they married someone who wasn't American, to work hours that were equitable to men, to access medical information and care, serve on a jury, and generally participate in economic and civil society on a level that was equitable to men. Controversies about women's rights in the U.S. continue to this day. Of course, the push for women's rights during the 1800s did not happen in a vacuum. It was accompanied by the widespread change of the Industrial Revolution, which alone reshaped and redefined gender roles in the United States. The idea that a woman's place is in the home has not existed throughout time. And I actually have a quote I want to share with you. It's from Susan M. Adams. And this quote is from 1856. She and her husband had recently moved from a boarding house in St. Paul to Shakopee. She wrote, "We trudged along through the mud and water and made what I call, quote, our own little shanty. We are glad enough to get to a place where we could feel at home. I made a fire, and soon we had a meal of nice salt pork and mush where we ate with thankful hearts." Women and men definitely had distinct roles in the home, but for a farming family, men and women did not work in distinct spheres. Now, of course, the desire of women to obtain the vote did not happen in a vacuum. As we've talked about, it was one of many big changes that was occurring in the time. Over the course of the 19th century, the United States changed very rapidly. And one of the ways was the switch from agrarian or farm life to factory life. In 1800, about 90% of Americans lived on farms, and what this meant is that pretty much everyone, regardless of gender or age, worked at home and contributed to the success of the family. Everyone's place was in the home. By 1900, only 40% of Americans lived on farms. City populations had surged and the age of factories had begun. This meant big changes for American women. For wealthy women, industrialization brought with it the creation of separate spheres divided by gender. Men went out and interacted in the world, and a woman's place was in the home. For less affluent women, the need for financial stability meant they often joined men in factory life. Though they toiled outside of the home alongside men, they had less pay, fewer opportunities, and little legal control of their assets. In Scott County, the move to industry happened more slowly. Though in 1900, Scott County was still largely agrarian, manufacturing was exploding, following new railroad lines throughout the region. Large manufacturing businesses began to come into Scott County at the end of the 1800s, along with the railroad. Reese Bottling Works came in 1872, Schroeder Brick and Limestone in 1876, George F. Strait and Company Flour Mill in 1878, and Minnesota Stove Company in 1891.
So what did the push for suffrage look like in Scott County? Well, it was won, like many other places, through grassroots work and committee work. Groups of women met, argued, discussed, distributed positions, organized, and wrote letters, and prominent committee members would travel different communities nearby and organize new groups to aid in the effort. Now, at the Scott County Historical Society, we have records of two different suffrage committees in Scott County, one that was organized in 1883 and another that was active in 1918. And I just want to zoom in here and show you the lists of the members, because for those of you who are familiar with Scott County history, some of these names might look familiar. So we have the 1883 committee and the 1918 committee here. Southworth, Schroeder, Duffy, Titus, and Strait were prominent families in publishing, industry, politics, and other areas. And looking over here, we have some of the homes of these families too. So this is the home of Eli and Lenora Southworth, who were both part of the suffrage committees. Eli was an attorney. Lenora was involved in many different local organizations. And you can see these were fairly well-off families. Here we have the home of Mr. and Mrs. H.P. Marks, and Mrs. Marks was part of the 1918 suffrage committee. We also have a few artifacts from these families. So here we have a jewelry box. Now this jewelry box is from the jewelry and optometry store owned by Mr. H.P. Marks, and it was sold between 1910 and 1930. We also have a good old Shakopee brick. Many of you have seen these, know about them. Some of you might own one. So this Shakopee brick is from Schroeder Brickyards. So Schroeder Brickyards was owned by Herman Schroeder, and his wife, Sophia Schroeder, was part of the 1918 suffrage committee.
These lists of names are almost certainly not exhaustive. For one thing, in order for us to know that these meetings existed, they had to have been published in the local newspaper. This means that the members chose to submit their meeting time or minutes, and the publisher chose to print them, a lot of ifs. Additionally, it is likely that not every member had their name included in this coverage. For example, for the 1918 committee, we likely only have the names of members who held office or were in charge of a particular project. We do know that Miss Hammond and Miss Bonfoy from the 1883 committee were young teachers due to their census listings. Miss Hammond also gave private music lessons.
Now I'd love to introduce you a little more closely to a few of the women who are deeply involved with suffrage work in Scott County. The first woman I'd like to introduce you to is this woman, Lenora Southworth. And I have a quote here from her obituary. Her long life in this community was characterized by sympathetic kindness for suffering, gentle humanity, a bright, cheerful optimism in all things, generous hospitality, and charity. So Lenora Southworth is a good example of what you might consider a typical early campaigner for women's suffrage. She was the wife of the Shakopee city attorney. She was financially comfortable, educated, and deeply involved in community work. She was born on April 24th, 1947. Through her life, she lived in St. Lawrence, Belle Plaine, St. Anthony, Horan, and then finally settled in Shakopee, where she lived for most of her life. She was the vice president of the 1883 Women's Suffrage Committee and served on the committee once again when it reemerged in 1918. Outside of her suffrage work, Lenora Southworth was president of the local Women's Relief Corps. Now, the WRC was the Women's Auxiliary of the Grand Army of the Republic, a fraternal organization of Northern Civil War veterans. She was also active in the Eastern Star Chapter, a public works group connected to the Freemasons. So, I have an artifact right here to show you. This is a certificate of honorable discharge. It's for Ida Collar, and it's from the Women's Relief Corps, branch number 70 in Shakopee. So this certificate notes that Ida Collar was initiated into the branch by Lenora Southworth. The next woman I want to introduce you to is Jane Titus, and Jane Titus is actually one of my very favorite figures from local history. So I have a quote from her obituary. Mrs. Titus lived an eventful and useful life. Now, Jane Lamont Titus was the daughter of Hanya Tu Kilwan, and I'd like to apologize to anyone who speaks Dakota because I'm sure I horribly mispronounced that. So she was a Dakota woman, and then she was also the daughter of Daniel Lamont, a Scottish fur trader. Jane's fathers passed away when she was very young, and her mother died when Jane was 17. At some point during Jane's youth, she was taken into the family of Samuel Pond, a prominent missionary in the Shakopee area. Throughout her life, Jane retained connections to both Dakota and European American communities. She eventually became a teacher at Oak Grove School with plans to travel to the Dakota Reservation to teach and do mission work. In 1850, Jane married Samuel Pond's nephew, Moses Titus, and then decided to remain in Shakopee. Now, Jane operated in a unique sphere. She was half Dakota, but also part of a prominent European American family. Her position allowed her to claim land in her own name, and if she had lived to see the passage of the 19th Amendment, would have likely allowed her to vote. This was not true for many Dakota people, even those with European ancestry. Moses Titus passed away in 1878, and Jane never remarried. She remained a prominent citizen of Shakopee, active in the Presbyterian Church and many community organizations. And we actually have a painting here of Jane Titus. This is on loan from the Shakopee Heritage Society, so thank you very much. And the painting was done by local artist Dave Geister.
I have a great additional story about Jane Titus to share. In 1857, Moses Titus, Jane's husband, Thomas Holmes, a land speculator often called the founder of Shakopee, and Henry Hines, a prominent local businessman, all put in competing claims on 50 acres of land in Shakopee. Moses Titus put in his claim first at the courthouse and then returned home thinking the matter was settled. Holmes and Hines came later, eventually coming to blows in the street over the section of land. Jane Titus witnessed the scene and went into the courthouse. As a person of both white and Dakota heritage, Jane was eligible for land through something called, at the time, the quote, half-blood tract. This legislation gave mixed-race people the option to claim land that was formerly Dakota territory, now owned by the federal government. Very few people of mixed heritage were able to actually take advantage of this opportunity. Land rights were often cheated, bought, or outright stolen by land speculators. Jane, possibly because of the prominence of her European American family, had managed to retain her land rights. She is able to claim the land in her own name, superseding the claims of her husband or the men who were brawling in the street.
Stories such as Jane's and Lenora's illustrate a very important point, that at this time, issues of suffrage were deeply entwined with issues of social class and race. In the 19th century and early 20th century, suffrage was often championed by middle and upper class women. Wealthy women often had more time and resources to deport to the cause, and they also had elevated social and financial security, and therefore less to fear if there was a backlash from those who opposed their views. Now, this doesn't mean that other women weren't interested in the vote. For working class women, the push for suffrage was often entwined with the labor movement at the time. Women joined unions to campaign for the vote, as well as for equal pay, control of their income, and safe working conditions. Race also impacted the fight for women's suffrage. At the time, Native Americans and Asian immigrants across the country were largely excluded from U.S. citizenship due to their race. Most African Americans in the South were also blocked from the vote by poll taxes, literacy tests, and other racial barriers.
A few more points about suffrage, race, and social class. As the panel says, wealthy women had more time and resources to devote to suffrage, but there were other factors that led to them being overrepresented. First, historians searching for suffrage committees in an area are going to find groups that were primarily focused on suffrage. For working class women, suffrage was one of many social injustices that they were fighting, and what political work they had time for was less likely to be solely focused on the vote. Wealthy and prominent women also had connections which allowed them to get their work published in newspapers or pamphlets, making it accessible to historians. This was not always the case for working class women. Finally, language matters. What was termed a committee meeting, parade, or even demonstration when it was organized by wealthy women might at the time have been called a riot, mob, or strike by the press when the majority of the participants were lower class. Race was also a complex part of the suffrage movement. Before the Civil War, abolition and suffrage movements were often entwined. Schisms formed after the passage of the 15th Amendment, which, on the surface, gave black men the right to vote. Some prominent women in the suffrage movement saw this as a betrayal of their cause. Later, African Americans would be excluded from some suffrage organizations and activities because the white participants did not want to cause controversy and potentially turn backers away by making their movement multiracial. The most famous story of this is that of Ida B. Wells, a journalist and anti-lynching advocate, as well as a suffrage advocate. She wanted to join a suffrage demonstration in Washington, D.C. in 1913. She was told that she could not join unless she marched with a separate, segregated group in the back. She refused and forced her way into the middle of the parade, effectively desegregating it. Finally, once women did get the vote, many African American women continued to be hindered of their rights. After Northern representatives pulled out of governments in Southern states, as we mentioned earlier, many restrictions were put into place. So what you see here is just a tiny section of a literacy test. And literacy tests in the South lasted well into the 20th century. They initially excluded formerly enslaved people, few of whom were able to read, and later, these tests were made technical, complicated, and difficult, and then sometimes administered only to African American voters. So what you see here is a tiny piece of the Alabama literacy test from 1965, and you can see how complex some of these questions are. If you want to check out the full test, we do have it available at the museum.
On this wall, we have a timeline of some big events in women's suffrage in the area, and then also some newspaper articles from local newspaper covering those events. So I'm just going to go through and give you a brief taste here. So in 1858, there was a bill calling for the removal of male as a voting requirement in the state constitution. And this was the first bill to reach the floor of the Minnesota House of Representatives about women voting. It was unfortunately laughed off the floor. The first mention of women's suffrage in the legal record actually happens in 1860, when Minnesota legislature received a bundle of petitions calling for the enfranchisement of women. Moving forward, this is the first example of women's suffrage in Minnesota. In 1875, men gave women the right to vote in school elections. The argument was that schools were extensions of the home and therefore an appropriate sphere for women. In 1878, an amendment was rejected allowing women to vote on alcohol bans, the argument being that if women did have the right to vote on this issue, they would use that vote to ban alcohol. The Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association was formed by Harriet Bishop, Sarah Stearns, and Julia Nelson in 1881. Within a year, it grew to 200 members. Now, as we saw in the past, the first known suffrage committee in Shakopee was formed in 1883. In 1885, the National Women's Suffrage Association held its national annual meeting in Minnesota. And in 1885, and continuing every single year until 1919, the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association put forward a bill for the legislative session asking for the vote for women. And here's a copy of an article from the Shakopee Courier from February 28, 1884. This is the first article that appears in Shakopee newspapers calling for women's suffrage. And in 1909, we had a huge spread in the Shakopee newspapers, and here's a quote as well as a couple of images from that spread explaining why women wanted the vote. So the quote is, "Of course a woman's place is in the home, so is a man's, but that does not prevent either from participating in the decision of who should govern the rights upon which the home is built. Think it over." So in 1914, a suffrage parade with over 2,000 marchers happens in Minneapolis. And then on 1919, on September 8th, Minnesota became the 15th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. Now, as the push for women's suffrage came closer to being realized, here's a few examples of the articles covering it that were published in Scott County papers. So here's from the Belle Plaine Herald, February 5th, 1914, Plea of Women Affects Wilson. And it's about how women toilers, or women who were working, came to Wilson and shared their concerns about their working conditions and how poverty was affecting their lives and how the vote would help them. But you notice the subline, he sees no way to aid their cause. Up here, we've got the Belle Plaine Herald, March 1st, 1917. It's about different bills that were approved in that session. It talks about prohibition, the wets and the dries, and then also talks about a suffrage bill. It says 10 years ago, it would have been a huge spectacular to have that bill on the floor. But at this point, it seemed a little bit more standard to the members of the legislature. This one's great. It's called A Suffragist Warning. It's from the Shakopee Tribune, March 6, 1917. saying that any political party that enters into possession of the federal government should believe that women's suffrage is a matter of national concern. And finally, we have one from the Scott County Argus, January 21st, 1919, mentioning that suffrage had finally scored a victory in the House. A bit changed in this country, politically, economically, technologically, and socially, during the time that women were campaigning for the right to vote. One of these catalysts for change that did impact women's rights was, unfortunately, war. Throughout American history, war has changed women's roles. When young men left to serve in the military, women were called to fill some of the places they had left behind. During the Civil War, women band together in organizations meant to support soldiers while contributing to the community in men's absence. After the war, ladies' aid groups continued to work towards improving society. Women's organizations rallied behind causes such as ending child labor, advancing education, and improving public health. World War I impacted women's roles again. Not only did female-led social organizations aid in the war effort, but women filled manufacturing and agricultural jobs. They were also employed by the military as doctors, nurses, ambulance drivers, and translators. And after the war, women wanted to continue to positively impact the country. So there's a few photos here I'd like to share with you. This one is of Matilda Stans of Shakopee, and actually her home is right next to the Scott County Historical Society on the same property. She's wearing a white nurse's uniform, and this photo was taken around 1910. Here we see a photo of nurses taking part in the World War I homecoming parade in Shakopee on October 10th, 1919. Now down here we have an artifact from the SCHS collection. This is a cookbook, and it was produced in 1916 by the Ladies' Aid Society of the Presbyterian Church in Shakopee. This book was sold to raise money for charitable causes, and they also raised funds by advertising in the book. Now, the Ladies' Aid Society is one of many women's organizations that sprung up in Scott County in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Some were connected to churches. Others had particular causes that they were rallying behind, like the Temperance Reform Club, the Humane Society, or the cause of suffering for the people in Ireland. But many of these organizations sprang from some of the war effort groups that were put together during the Civil War and during World War I.
So taking a closer look at one of these wars, we're going to look at the Civil War. So during the Civil War, women served in an unofficial capacity in many of the roles they would take on officially during Wars I and II. Women traveled with the military, serving as nurses, spies, cooks, and laundresses. Around 400 women that we know of, plus many who likely have been lost to history, concealed their gender to fight in the war. On the home front, thousands of ladies' aid societies were formed. These groups provided for wartime burials, organized aid for widows and orphans of veterans, sent medical supplies to hospitals, and sent money to aid injured troops. Most manufacturing was also done in the North at the time. During the Civil War, women went from 1/4 to 1/3 of the manufacturing workforce in America. Fights for equal pay, hours, and treatment for women in the workforce followed soon after the war ended. Zooming into Scott County, at the time of the Civil War, the county was mostly agrarian and had a small European population. Scott County sent around 650 soldiers to fight in the Civil War, but that was of about 5,000 European American residents. This meant that women at home were taking up agricultural work, running farms, planting, and harvesting crops. Now, we don't have that many first-person women's stories from Scott County during that time period, but there's one woman I want to introduce you to. This is Sophia Bosling. Sophia Bosling was born on May 20th, 1815 in Hanover, Germany. As a young woman, she and her husband Christian traveled to the United States and settled in Belle Plaine. They had one son named Ernest. Ernest enlisted to fight in the Civil War when he was only 15, getting around age requirements with a note from his parents. It is unclear whether the note was real or not. Ernest fought for 2 years and lost his life at the siege of Vicksburg when he was only 17. Sophia's husband passed away soon after, and she never remarried. Instead, she dedicated her life to charitable pursuits. She saved her inheritance and what she could from her son's pension checks towards opening a home for widows and orphans. Her dream was finally realized on November 8, 1898, when she opened The Home in Belle Plaine. It is said that Sophia herself moved into the facility just a few days before her death. Today, The Home is known as Kings Path Senior Living. This story shows how wars caused tragedy, but they also opened up civil action and public work opportunities for women. It is also important to note that another war was being fought in the area at the time of the Civil War. For many Dakota women, this time period meant sweeping change, including removal from their homes and separation from their families during the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. Many Dakota women and children in the aftermath of that war were taken to a concentration camp below Fort Snelling. Native Americans, men and women, were not guaranteed the right to vote nationwide until 1962.
Now, Scott County actually saw some fairly immediate changes after women got the vote, and one was the advancement of women in politics. So I have a great quote here. This is from the Jordan Independent, March 11th, 1926. And it says, "Scott County is becoming quite the feminist stronghold." And the reason for that is that Scott County, specifically Shakopee and Prior Lake, both elected female mayors soon after the right to vote. Now, these women, Elizabeth Rees and Cora McQuestion, were treated as novelties by the news, but they weren't made fun of in a negative way. In fact, they were praised for the publicity they brought to the county. So I want to zoom in and introduce you to these women a little bit more closely. So first, we have Elizabeth Rees. Now, Elizabeth Rees was the daughter of Rees Bottling Works founder Jacob Rees, and she was elected mayor of Shakopee on April 10, 1925. The Shakopee Argus called her election a surprise that developed. Her name was submitted by supporters, and at the 11th hour, she won by 29 votes. Now, she took full advantage of her position to give publicity to the town. She posed for photographs in national newspapers with Shakopee products, and she even presented President Calvin Coolidge with his own Shakopee-made Sanico stove. The Argus said that she possessed a system full of energy. While she was in office, she successfully lobbied the State Highway Department to build a bridge at Holmes Street and oversaw the challenge to move the county seat from Shakopee to Jordan or Lydia. She also managed the Rock Spring Cafe in Shakopee. And you can see a photograph of the Rock Spring Cafe here. Elizabeth Rees is on the far left behind the bar. Now, after her 2 terms as mayor, Rees served as Shakopee's postmaster, chairman of the Scott County Fair Women's Committee, secretary of the County Poultry Association. During World War I, she was county chairman of the Liberty Bond Drive, and during World War II, she was director of the Citizen Service and County Defense. Over here, we have this simple red book. Now, this seems like a standard object, but it has a pretty heavy weight in county history. So this was the Club Journal of the Citizens Progressive Club. And the Citizens Progressive Club was formed by Shakopee Mayor Elizabeth Rees with the goal of keeping the county seat in Shakopee instead of moving it to Jordan. The next woman I'd like to introduce you to is Cora McQuestion. And in her obituary, the Jordan Independent called her a woman of strong mind and forthrightness. So she was elected to mayor of Prior Lake Village on March 11, 1926. And at the time, the paper described her as a woman of courage. She was born Cora Madden in 1885 in Glendale Township and moved to Prior Lake in 1909 after marrying her husband, James. She really rose into public prominence in 1922. Her family's home was across the street from Prior Lake Bank, and one evening, Cora McQuestion noticed bank robbers assembling below her window. She grabbed the family shotgun and charged out to foil the outlaws. With this history, she unsurprisingly ran on a campaign of greater law enforcement. During her tenure in office, prohibition arrests picked up pace. In her obituary, she's noted as being widely read, and her time as mayor is marked by the addition of a high school curriculum to the Prior Lake Village School. So here's Cora McQuestion with her daughter. So this is a genuine ballot box. It's the ballot box from Sand Creek Township that was used in government elections between 1900 and 1940. And not only do we have the box here, we also have the key that was used to open it. While we're talking about prohibition, I'd like to take a closer look at suffrage and temperance. Because today, suffrage and the temperance movements may seem like very different causes. To modern eyes, the suffrage movement is rooted in common sense, equity, and justice, while prohibition might come across as naive or moralistic. At the time, however, the movements were actually closely linked, both in message and in membership. Temperance in many ways was a women's issue. In 1830, the average American drank 7.1 gallons of pure alcohol per year, although of course much of it was heavily diluted in the form of wine or beer. In comparison, that number is down to 2.3 gallons per person. On top of this, due to social customs, in 1800s, alcohol consumption was dominated by men. Women had few legal protections in cases where household income or property went to fuel alcoholism, and they had few options in seeking legal protections or fleeing an abusive relationship. Many saw the vote as a way to protect themselves legally and financially from social problems associated with alcohol. The largest women's organization by membership in the early 1900s, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, advocated strongly for women's suffrage as well as prohibition, arguing that women would use their vote to advance the moral progress of the nation. Additionally, suffrage activists found that linking their cause to temperance gave a moral and religious weight to suffrage and attracted people who might otherwise have been indifferent to the cause. So here I have a really neat item from the Scott County Historical Society collections. This is a handwritten set of lyrics to a temperance song. It was written in 1880, and the lyrics read, "Our youthful hearts with temperance burn, away the bowl. From dream slopes all our steps we churn, away the bowl. Goodbye to rum and all its harms, farewell wine cups, boasted charms, away the bowl, away the bowl, away the bowl. See how the staggering drunkard wheels, away the bowl. Alas, the misery he reveals, away the bowl. Goodbye to rum and all its harm, farewell the wine cup's boasted charms, no alcohol will buy or sell, away the bowl. The tippler's offer we repel, away the bowl. United in a temperance band, we're joined in hearts, we're joined in hand." And this is actually the perfect segue to our main gallery exhibit, which is on the history of Prohibition in Scott County. So if that's something you're interested in, we actually have a tour of that exhibit as well. It's up on our YouTube page and our website, so be sure to check that out. Thanks so much for joining us for this tour of Votes for Women's Suffrage in Scott County. And as I said before, if you have any questions or anything you want additional information on, don't hesitate to reach out to us at info@scottcountyhistory.org. Thanks, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.